Hello, everyone. Welcome to the American Museum of Fly Fishing, and this our second episode of Tackle Talk. I'm thrilled to be joined today by John Marci. John is a rod builder and restorationist, and he's going to talk today a little bit about bamboo rods, trying to take some of the mystique away from them and introduce the bamboo rods to new fly fishers or people that are new to fishing bamboo rods.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it. I think the important concept that we really want to understand going into this talk is this is really about introductory bamboo fly rods. It's about rods that just the normal generalist can attain and use. It's not the Leonards and Garrisons and Hoagie Carmichaels of the bamboo rod world. It's going to be the South Bends and the Heddens and the Grangers, which I think is a really important concept for people to understand. I think it's important for people to understand that there is certainly great opportunities out there, but there's also pitfalls. So we want to make sure that people understand the concept of the bamboo fly rod.
Okay.
We want to make sure that people understand the names associated with bamboo fly rods, right? And that goes all the way from South Bends. So I'll talk about the Powells and the Orvises, really on the high end of the introductory type bamboo fly rods. And I think that it's exciting for people to get into bamboo, but it's also very intimidating. So want to try and take some of the mystique out of it, but also want to educate some people on what it really takes to get a rod that's complete and can be used, and some of the things to look for when you're actually buying the rod. Mm-hmm. The days of $40 bamboo fly rods at yard sales and garage sales, they don't happen very much anymore. It does happen, but not very much.
Not very often. In fact, I think the major or the perception is that any rod, if it's bamboo, is incredibly valuable. And that's not necessarily true. But it doesn't mean that the bamboo rods that don't cost that much money aren't fishable or good fishable rods.
And I think it really comes down to how you define valuable.
Okay.
Right. So a rod that you can bring out and fish 30 days a year, I think is incredibly valuable. Whether that's a $40 rod or a $4,000 rod, a $4,000 rod that sits in a closet isn't worth anything at all to me. So the $40 rod that I can pick up and use and bring to the bat and kill. We're in the Northeast. I think most people recognize that. I live here. I fish the bat and kill a lot. The rod that I can bring to the bat and kill and fish and catch really nice brown trout is incredibly valuable to me. So good, that's all good stuff. And that's what we really want to try and conceptualize in this presentation. Now, I'll be incredibly transparent. I haven't given this presentation in a couple of years, so I'm going to be making up some of this along the way, which I think is okay. I kind of live this stuff. So it's exciting for me to give a podcast because this is absolutely my first podcast ever.
Oh, that's great.
So we'll see how this goes.
Okay, well, I'm glad to have you here. And of course, I'm going to be more or less an advocate. I'm going to be asking some questions, some of the questions that are posted in the museum, and hopefully these are questions that people may have as well. So are you ready to get into the PowerPoint presentation?
Absolutely, bring it on.
All right, so let's go ahead and we're going to share the screen here with you. Let's do this and that. And there we go.
Outstanding. So I think it's just to set the stage. I'm an incredibly passionate person when I dive into a new concept. And about 10, 12 years ago, I dove into bamboo fly rods. Maybe it was 15 years ago. It's amazing how time flies. And I really made the effort to try and learn the whole process. Tried to learn the history of bamboo fly rods. I went through the restoration process, and then I began the building process. And now through I can say the Catskill Fly Fishing Museum at the American Museum of Fly Fishing. I don't want to create a war. I spend some time in September, trying to teach beginners the concepts of building bamboo fly rods. I own a company, an LLC called the Adirondack Rod Company. Full disclosure, the Adirondack Rod Company is really not functional at this point. I have a full-time job. I work a lot of hours. Rod building, rod restoration is a passion of mine. I don't have time to actually take on work. So as part of this concept, that company exists but I'm really not in business. So the nice part about this is if somebody has questions, they can email me at the Adirondack Rod Company at gmail.com. And I'm not trying to do any business. So I'm more than happy to interact with people, answer questions, and there's no pressure because I'll be honest with you, I just don't need work or want work at this point in my career. I need to finish up my day job before I start doing the restoration and rod building for a living piece.
Okay.
If I ever get there. But the LLC does exist, and you can reach out to me. I don't know if the email address is on the slide deck, but it may actually be on your posting. So
it is, yes.
So you can certainly look at the posting and go from there. So over the past 15 years, I've learned a lot. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've had a lot of fun learning the concepts of historical bamboo rods from 1910 through, I'll go with current day. And to be honest with you, I've made a lot of flat out mistakes. So I've spent a lot of money on rods that I haven't spent a lot of money, but my wife might watch this. I've spent money on rods that were flat out mistakes. So I'm hoping to give people some information which they can use in order to avoid some of the mistakes that I've made in the past. So from that, I think it's important to understand conceptually, if I can get the slide to move forward. If we can get the slide to move forward, this isn't me, this is a technical glitch. Why would you want to use bamboo flat rods? I've given this presentation a number of times, and ultimately in every single one of the presentations, someone says, why would I want to use this? I've got a graphite rod, it does everything I want it to do. It casts great, it casts long distances. And I think that's great. I use graphite rods, I use fiberglass rods, I use bamboo rods. I generally use bamboo rods more than the previous two, because there's some advantages to bamboo rods that you don't get with graphite and fiberglass, but there's also some disadvantages. You'll see on this slide, some of the cons. The weight of a bamboo fly rod, typically they're traditionally more heavy because they're solid built organic material. A lot of people think they cost a lot of money. One of the myths that I'm hoping to disprove in this presentation, and you'll see the arrow go from con cost to pro inexpensive, is you can really get a great bamboo fly rod for not very much money and use it every day. It'll last you the rest of your life. Are they available? People don't know where to find them. Once again, a con. People think it takes a tremendous amount of time to maintain them, and it really doesn't. As long as you're good with your equipment, they're just as formidable as a graphite rod. I would say probably more formidable. And then they're slow. Bamboo fly rods can be slow. Bamboo fly rods can be incredibly quick if you know the types of rods to build.
Of course.
Or to use, I should say, not build, but building works also. I don't think most people would get into a really fast bamboo fly rod with what we're going to talk about in this presentation, because the rods I'm talking about are going to be the 30s through the 50s, and they tended to be a little bit slower. But there was some rods during the 40s, 50s, and 60s that were a little bit faster. So they're definitely available. Some of the pros related to bamboo, and it's the antithesis of some of the cons. Bamboo fly rods can be slow, which in this world we live in right now, sometimes using a slow fly rod might be an advantage, right? Everything goes 100 miles an hour. Using a fly rod that makes you slow down and enjoy yourself, slow down and actually present a fly to a fish as opposed to just chucking spears at a fish, is quite a pro to me. I think it's a great opportunity to really enjoy the sport that we participate.
Question for you, two things actually. The first, there's a lot of folks that are almost, forgive my use of the word, fearful of using bamboo because they think it's very delicate. Is that close to accurate?
I would argue that it is not close to accurate, and the reasons for that are pretty straightforward. A solid piece of material is going to have more structural integrity than a hollow piece of material. Now, if you roll up a bamboo fly rod in a car window, it's going to break. But a graphite rod is going to do the same.
They'll do the same,
right?
Sure.
Ceiling fans, car windows, screen doors. It's the reality of the things that break fly rods. Traditionally, fish don't break fly rods. People break fly rods. limits, right? So if you're fighting a tarpon off of the handle and you grab a foot above the handle and pull really hard, I don't care what it's made out of, it's going to break.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
When I do this presentation live, I bring a stick that I built and I put it on the floor and I say, how many people would take their, I'm not going to use Orvis because we're in the backyard of Orvis.
Okay.
How many people take their sage fly rod and stand on it and think it's going to withstand that pressure? I can do that with bamboo. That tells you there's some formidability to that piece of material. That makes sense to you?
It does. It
Yep.
does. Now, the other thing you mentioned is that the action of bamboo is typically slow versus the fast actions on today's graphite rods. But is it a situation where if you slow down a little and let the bamboo, the rod itself, do the work during the cast, it's a bit more enjoyable than a fast action graphite rod?
I think it really comes down to how you define enjoyable. If you let the line load the rod, you will find that the rod does everything that a graphite rod does. It's probably more forgiving if you let the rod load, a little bit less forgiving if you don't let the rod. A graphite rod has the ability to correct some sloppy timing with your cast. A bamboo rod, if you let the rod fully load, it will provide you with a very satisfying presentation to a fish.
Okay.
That would be my take on it. I think that answers your question.
It does. Yeah.
Yep. So a couple of the other things, variability. One of the really neat parts about bamboo is there's a lot of variability in the rods that were made over the last, I'll say 100 years. I mean, it's well over 100 years. I have rods that are 110 years old and I'm still fishing, 115 years old. You know, so that rod built in the teens versus the rods that I built this past winter are very different, right? So that variability is tremendous. And I think two of the other pros that are often really understood by some people and not so understood by others is the history related to bamboo rods is fascinating. With all due respect to Sage and St. Croix, I don't even know if St. Croix is still in business. St. Croix, Orvis, Winston. Winston does have a little bit of history, but it's mostly history from their bamboo rod building. There's not a lot of history in graphite fly rod, right? Because they came out in the 60s-ish. They got better in the 70s, still not quite good. In the 80s, they started to get better, and then they really blew up in the 90s and 2000s. But when you think about, you know, companies like F.E. Thomas and Leonard, they were building rods in the teens, and those rods are every bit as good today, still functional and working well as they were, you know, 100 years ago, which is kind of a neat history piece. And one of the things I think I talk about later in the presentation, but I'm going to drop the name right now just because I think it's worth people taking a look at if they truly have an interest in the history of bamboo rods, is George Black wrote a book called Casting the Spell, which is a really interesting take on bamboo rod progression over time. I think it's something that people should spend a little bit of time taking a look at. It really correlates bamboo rod escalation or propensity to develop with the American Industrial Revolution, which is kind of a neat concept. As people got more money, they wanted more stuff. As they wanted more stuff, people started to put more effort into building the sporting items that they would use. Goes in parallel with the shotgun market in the United States. So kind of a neat concept. And then kind of the weird piece is just the casual style of bamboo rods, right? Anybody can bring a graphite rod into a room and people are, it's a graphite rod. You bring a bamboo rod into a room and it's like, wow, that's a bamboo rod. It's kind of a neat, it's a neat piece of, word, but it's a neat piece of style associated with this fishing. Kind of get the same thing with reels a little bit. I know you're big on reels.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Yes.
I confess I am. Yeah.
Yes. So I think we'll go to the next slide if I can make it work. Some of the rod features I think people need to understand. Right. So bamboo fly rods traditionally come in 2 pieces with 2 tips, 3 pieces with 2 tips, or 2 pieces with 1 tip, 3 pieces with 1 tip. And I would say 3 pieces with 1 tip are not nearly as prevalent as the other 3 configurations. Lots of different ferrules on the market back in the day, but primarily they were either rolled or they were hand welted soldered. So basically, I think I've got a picture of ferrules coming up, but if you can imagine a rolled top on the ferrule itself, which the ferrules are the piece that mates the butt section to the tip section. It's typically made of nickel silver, can be made of some lesser quality materials if you get into really cheap rods. And then there's the second type is a hand welted or a soldered ferrule. And those are traditionally going to be on your more expensive or better quality. Weights of bamboo fly rods from, we'll say, the 30s to the 60s, because I think that's where that's kind of the sweet spot, are going to be anywhere from 3 ounces for a smaller rod to 6 ounces for a bigger salmon type fly rod. But don't be fooled by that. I'm going to talk a little bit about it a little bit later. Some of the West Coast rod builders built some fairly large rods in really low weights, right? And there's some patents associated with those that are really exciting if you follow the history of bamboo rod building. And I would go so far as to say that the vast majority of the people that are building bamboo fly rods now for bigger rods are using concepts related to those patents, which were developed in the 1930s. So it's kind of interesting to take a concept from the 1930s and people are still working with it to this day. They've perfected it a little bit more. They've got finer pieces of equipment to make things a little bit more accurate and a little bit more I'll call it efficient. But it's still the same process, which is really neat.
It's a testament to the quality of the builders that were back in the day. It's just remarkable what they.
It's amazing how smart they were, right? And unfortunately, I don't know that people give them quite enough credit as they deserve, because there was a couple of people on the West Coast that really thought about fishing for really big fish and casting all day long, as well as casting long distances in tournament casting type situations where they wanted a really light rod so that they could load a really heavy line and cast a long ways, which anybody that thinks a bamboo fly rod can't cast a long ways, just take a look at some of those casting records from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. You can throw it a long ways. Yes,
you can. And I'll take this opportunity to mention that Joan Wolf used a bamboo rod, cast 161 feet in a competition. That's pretty remarkable.
And I struggle to cast 61 feet. So just to put things in perspective.
So John, if I may, I'm going to go back to one of the first points you made about the pieces. So when you look at a rod, sometimes you'll find that the rod does come with either one piece. Sometimes they come with 2. And in some cases, you'll find that they come with 3 tips. What was the general purpose for the manufacturers to produce these rods with multiple tips?
So looking at the bamboo, the blue collar bamboo rods that we're really trying to focus on here, right? I think very rarely would you see them with 3 tips.
Okay.
Right. So they made the rods for the mass market. Right. So they made them for my grandfather, my father, my grandfather, his father. They made them for people that worked for a living. Right. So the Heddens, the Grangers, South Bend, Montague, they traditionally are going to build a 3-piece 2-tip rod, which gave you a second tip to bring out into the field with you in case you broke one of the tips.
Okay.
The 3-piece 3-tip rods would have been more of a specialty item, which probably would have got outside of the wheelhouse of those house manufacturers, right? And I think I talk about this a little bit more, so we may repeat some stuff. But if you conceptually think about a bamboo rod building shop, they made tens of thousands of rods a year, right? So the company Orvis, right next door, they're on about 100,000 rods since the 40s. Right? There's probably a few more than that didn't get cataloged, etc. All that stuff, right? Somebody like South Bend made that in a couple of years, right? So they're building rods just as fast as they can pump them into the market, because they sold a $5 rod, a $10 rod, a $15 rod, a $20 rod. So in order to make money, you had to have efficiencies. So you made butt sections, mid sections, tip sections, and nobody wants to hear this. They were all the same. Some of the node spacing may have been better on some of the pieces, and they would have gone into the better quality rods. But when they went to a wall and they pulled a butt section out, they looked at it. If it looked good for a $30 rod, that's what they used on the 30. If it looked good for a $5 rod, it could have been the same butt section as a $30 rod. They didn't have time to check it out.
Understood.
They had to make stuff. So from a pieces perspective, 2x2s, pretty not as traditional as a 3x2 from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. They did exist. They're wonderful rods to attain and use. Typically a little bit more expensive. We're going to talk about that later, so I don't want to steal that thunder.
Understood.
Reel seats, lots of different reel seats. I say lots. There's 3 different types of reel seats on the market. There's slide bands, this is graphite stuff. So slide bands, up locking, down locking reel seats. So pretty traditional, not something that I think people need to spend very much time thinking about. And then the lengths, anywhere from 6 feet to 9.5 feet. And we're going to talk about cost, but obviously a 6-foot rod is going to be a lot more expensive than a 9.5 foot rod.
And the
With
reason,
some exceptions.
and the typical reason for that is?
Not as many of them available, right?
Yeah.
So back when my grandfather fished, everybody in the country, with a few exceptions, but everybody that worked in a paper mill or worked in a wire mill or worked in a steel mill used a 9-foot 3-piece 2-tip rod. Because why a 9-foot 3-piece 2-tip rod? Because you could use worms in the morning, you can use minnows in the afternoon, and you can cast flies at night.
Gotcha.
And that's what my grandfather did. Right. So upstate New York, north of Utica, or actually Utica proper, but just north of Utica, that's what he did. He used all those devices. So all good stuff.
Gotcha.
We'll go to the next slide. What's available on the market? So I would call it 4 main categories. We've got really cheap, and we'll get into these in detail. We've got really cheap, which I would classify as junk. We've got cheap, which is serviceable fishing poles. We've got good rods, which I would consider really the sweet spot. And then you've got exceptional, you've got exceptional stuff, valuable. Doesn't mean you can't attain it on a blue collar price tag, but it's just a little bit hard to find at a good price tag. And we'll talk about some of these in detail. Really cheap stuff. From a price perspective, they should be free. To be quite honest with you, because the reality is they're tomato sticks. They're not really good for much, and we're going to get into some of this details in the next section.
Okay.
But just setting the stage, the characteristics of a really cheap rod. The rule of thumb when you build bamboo fly rods is you should have at least 1 more guide than the length of the rod. So if you have a 7-foot rod, you should have at least 8 guides. I would say you probably need 9, but you need at least 8. That makes sense? On some of these 8.5-foot or 9-foot cheap rods, you'll have 1 on the butt, you'll have 2 on the mid, and 3 on the tip. It's just a really sloppy casting. Cheap seats, they're going to be chrome-plated brass, nickel-plated brass. They tend to split. They're not very formidable. And then cheap ferrules. Rolled welts or no welts, no water stops, and they tend to split. They don't hold up really well. Some of the brands that you would see that are really cheap rods are World War II occupied Japan rods, Grampus. If it's a weird name, it may very well be a Japanese rod.
Sure. They
They came over in the hundreds of thousands after World War II because Japan needed a market, and they had a market because it was occupied. So they basically gave these rods to GIs. They brought them back. You'll typically find them in a wooden box.
wooden box with all the flies
With
and
all-
little
yep.
plastic sleeves and
Yeah, and even if you took one of those that still had the saran wrap on it, I don't know if they had saran wrap, but whatever the material is that they wrapped them in, it's still not, it's not a very good fly rod, and it's not worth very much. Horrick and Ibbotson, Montague, South Bend, some of their trade rods. Horrick and Ibbotson, Montague, South Bend, some of their branded rods. And when we get to the next section, I'm going to talk about how rods are scaled. But remember, Horrick and Ibbotson, they made rods from $2 to $50. That $2 rod is really just a tomato. And it's really because of the way it was built. And we'll talk about the reasons why that is, I think, in the next slide.
And just going back, just really quick, to identify a Horrick and Ibbotson rod, would you often find a little label that said UTK?
That would definitely be one of the methods. Horrick and Ibbotson, if I remember correctly, and when I get to the end of the presentation, there's a reference document that says these are some of the books you should look for if in fact you wanted to get into identifying rods and restoration. And so you're going to see that a little bit later. Excuse me. And the Bamboo Rod Restoration Handbook by Michael Sinclair. I say this to everybody that'll listen. If you're into the history of bamboo rods and you really want to understand them, spend whatever it takes to get one of his books, one of those books, and you'll read it to the point where the pages fall out because it's just so much fun to read. He teaches you how to identify them. He teaches you the components. He teaches you the thread colors. He teaches you how to restore them. It's just a marvelous book. And
Good recommendation.
and that is still available. I don't know if the current printing is still available, but I've heard rumors that they're going to try and do another printing of it, and it's well worth getting. And I'll be honest with you, if you can get it, buy it from him because he'll autograph it, and he's a great man. So it's good stuff. So some of the brands that are examples of less expensive rods. Grampus, we talked about earlier. Sports King, which I believe was made for Montgomery Wards. South Bend, which is a huge manufacturer that made some really nice rods, but also made some really bad rods in Indiana. Montague, which is right over the border in Massachusetts from where we are right now. I guess it would be over that border, not my border. Hork and Ibbotson, which was in Utica, New York, and Shakespeare, which did a lot of trade rods. Shakespeare had a lot of people make rods for them, but I think they did some of their own rods. Once again, they made some really nice rods, but they also made some poor ones. Spiegel, which I think was the Spiegel company, typically was going to be it would be a Montague product. And then Winchester, and I say be careful because Winchester had E.W. Edwards make rods for him for a period of time, right? So if you find the right Winchester, it could be a great rod, but Winchester also had some fairly less expensive rods.
Understood.
So cheap, what I would call serviceable fishing poles. These are the rods that you can buy between $50 and we'll say $250 or $300, right? The sweet spot from my perspective, if you find a reputable person to sell it to you, is going to be in that $100 to $200 price range. And if you get a good one and you hate it and you paid $150 for it, the most you can lose is $150. That's not awful, right? That's not awful. When you put it on eBay, you're going to get $100 for it, right? So you can try a rod, fish it for a year or two, hate it, put it back on eBay, or put it on eBay, I should say, and you'll lose $50. What can you do for a year for $50?
Sure.
Right? So this is the place where I think most people need to start. Some of the characteristics, they have more guides, right? So if you take an 8.5 foot rod, it's going to have a guide on the butt section, 3 on the mid, 4 on the tip, or 2 on the mid, 4 on the tip. It's going to get you closer to that, one more than the length of the rod. Typically they'll have cheaper seats, right? Because they got to keep the cost down,
right?
And they'll have chrome plated brass ferrules, nickel, silver brass ferrules, nickel plated brass ferrules. A lot of different options there. It really comes down to the company that manufactured the rods. And typically they're going to have a rolled well. What you're really hoping for here is if you understand the company, and we'll talk about this in the next slide. You understand the company. Some companies made much better ferrules than other companies. And Montague and South Bend had some really trashy ferrules. They also had some good ferrules. When you're in the lesser expensive rods or the cheaper rods, inexpensive rods, they're going to have those lesser quality.
Sure.
They'll tend to split. And when they split, it becomes you're chasing your tail trying to fix that rod. Some of the brands for cheap, what I would call serviceable fishing poles or cheap rods, Wright McGill, Head and Trade rods. Certainly HI Montague, South Bend all had decent rods that were in that midpoint. And then some of the Head and branded rods, the lower models, the 10s, the 12s, the 10s and the 13s and the 14s certainly fall into that category. That's an example of a Head and Trade rod that was made for a hardware store out in the Midwest that I restored a number of years ago. I'm not even sure where that rod is. I think it's out in Montana right now, sitting at a friend's house underneath one of his beds, waiting for me to come back out and use it.
Now, with a Head and rod, John, the model number that you mentioned, and which is indicative of the grade of the rod, those numbers are typically found inked just above the cork handle. Is that accurate?
That is correct. So when you look at, and it kind of is a nice segue into this next slide, from a South Bend perspective, if you're looking at what I would call the good fishing pole category, South Bend Model 300s and 100 series are wonderful entries into a market. I would try and stay in the 8.5 foot, but if you're fishing for bass, panfish, a 9-footer is perfectly fine. Montague flip lines, Red Wings, and Fish Kills, wonderful fly rods. They'll have a tendency to have a few more guides on them. From an HI perspective, some of the brand name or the model names would be the old High Test, Burnley, the Spinner, Canada Creek, and Chancellor. They're typically not going to get much higher in cost than this category. If they are, they've got to be really, really nice, and I still wouldn't advise somebody to pay that much money. The Wright and McGill trade rods. Wright and McGill was a company out of Colorado, which purchased the Granger company, I'm gonna say 1938-ish, 36-ish. Granger was a marvelous manufacturer of fly rods. Wright and McGill was more of a manufacturing house, purchased the Granger company and started marketing the Wright and McGill Grangers. Some of their trade rods, as well as some of their really low-end branded rods, you can get in this price point, and they're marvelous fishing boats.
Okay.
And then some of the Heddon trade rods. Heddon made rods for basically any major sporting goods store in the United States. You'll see them under the names of Weber, Weber, Lyle and Colson, Tyrone, Shakespeare, Marvin Hedge, which if you ever have a chance to cast a Marvin Hedge made Heddon rod, they're very unique, and they are machines when it comes to casting a fly rod. I've had the privilege of casting a number of them. The 8'3" #2 ferrule is about the best casting rod I've ever picked up in my life.
So Marvin Hedge, of course, was really well known in the tournament casting circles. Are all of the Marvin Hedge rods fitted with that unique thumb piece on the cork handle? Is that a good identification tool?
So it's a good identification tool, but other companies did it also. South Bend did it.
Comfo
I
grip,
believe South Bend did the Comfo grip. Marvin Hedge is a little bit different because it was, instead of built into the thumb, into the actual cork, it was built out of the cork.
Right.
Paul Young did a thumb imprint in his rods. Orvis, West Jordan, the West Jordan model bamboo fly rod had a thumb imprint / heel of your hand imprint. I've never actually cast one of those. I've cast a lot of Orvis rods, but I've never cast one of the West Jordan models. I don't know how much of an advantage it is, but kind of neat stuff. I have a F.E. Thomas that has a thumb indent built into it, which I don't know if that was aftermarket or if it was part of the original build of that fly rod.
Okay.
So a lot of companies did it. Hedge is really interesting because not only do you have the thumb extruding from the cork, you have dimples built into the cork. So it's kind of a neat rod built for casting. I mean, he was a big caster. That's what he wanted to do. And then once again, Heddon made them for $300. If you ever got a hold of Michael Sinclair's Heddon book, there's a laundry list of companies that Heddon built for. If you wanted 10 rods, they would build you 10 rods under your brand in whatever model you wanted. And then this is the interesting part that will answer your question. Heddon is a classic example of American manufacturing. And Granger was the same way, right? McGill was the same way. But Heddon is a little easier to understand, only because they have numbers on their names, whereas Granger has names on their names, right? Granger Victory, the Special, the Aristocrat.
Sure.
It's a little bit harder to understand the hierarchy. Heddon's hierarchy is really easy. They made a Model 8, they made a Model 10, they made a Model 13, they made a Model 14, they made a Model 17, a 20, a 35. There was a 22 in there, but we're not going to talk about that. They made a Model 50, they made a Model 1000. When you look at that hierarchy, what Heddon is telling you is, if you give me $17, I'll give you a fly rod, which is nicer than the $14 one, nicer than the $13.
Makes perfect sense.
It does. But the concepts associated with American manufacturing are really interesting when you think about the Heddon company. If you buy a Model 8, or if you buy a Model 17, an 8.5-foot #2 ferrule Model 8 is the same exact taper as an 8.5-foot #2 ferrule Model 1000, which was their highest price rod, which was $100. Same exact taper. But what the differences were is the quality of the cane. They took the good stuff out of the actual bins.
Okay.
They did some more sorting, basically, as it comes down to, which took longer. They gave you better hardware. They gave you more guides. So a Model 8, 8.5-foot Heddon rod would have 7 guides on it. A Model 50, which was $50, would likely have, somebody's going to correct me in the comments at some point, but I'm going to say 11. Maybe it was 12, right? So when you think about manufacturing, making the cane costs the same amount of money, whether you're building a cheap one or an expensive one, because it's the same manufacturing process. You take that bamboo, you run it through a mill or a saw, depending on which company you are, and then you cut the taper, you glue it up, you throw it in a rack. That's the same amount of money, whether it's a really expensive one or a less expensive. Where the cost savings is, or the efficiencies, I should say, is if you're building a Model 8 with 7 guides versus a Model 50 with 11 guides, you can do 6 of or 10 of these in a day if you're really good at it. You can only do 3 of the Model 50s, right? So if you're going to bang out fly rods as hard as you can to make 100,000 a year, you got to look for efficiencies. So the Model 8 had variegated thread, no tip. The Model 50 had 1 tone and a light color with tipping, intermediate wraps, made it look pretty. Signature wraps, not intermediate wraps, but signature wraps had wood seats, had nickel silver hardware that had to be fitted really to tight tolerances, got put into a nice tube with a nice sock that cost twice as much as the sock you got with the Model 8. So they would make a lot more Model 8s for the masses and a lot less Model 50s for the wealthy folks, but they satisfied the whole market. Right? So it's really kind of neat. So from a good fishing pole perspective, I would recommend to people to stick with the Model 10s, Model 13s, or even Model 14s, because that's a wonderful way to get an entry into the market for what I would call good fishing poles.
Excellent.
Good stuff there. Granger, same idea, because I think both of those companies are really good first rods. Granger, you want to look at the Champion, the Victory, and the Special. Those are 3 good entry points for that company.
Excellent.
Nice part about Granger, or Wright McGill, is they tended to use more guides than Heddon did on their less expensive. So I'm going to digress for a quick second. I think I'm going to digress multiple times over the next 3 slides. That's what a rolled ferrule looks like, right? If you look at the ferrules, the nickel silver ferrules on these rods, this is 3 different Heddon rods that were restored, all with red, obviously all with red thread, black tipping on 2 of them. If you didn't know, I'm a huge fan of red, so that's why you see this. And those are all the least expensive ferrules that Heddon made. I would argue to people, argue with people, argue to people, indicate to people that I believe the less expensive Heddon ferrules are actually better than their good. That's just my opinion. I've seen split expensive Heddon ferrules. I've never seen a split cheap Heddon ferrule. So the nickel silver on them are quite good. Wright McGill, Granger use the same ferrules on all their rods.
Okay.
They didn't have 2 different types of ferrules. And you'll hear me talk about Granger and Heddon because I think that's really the right rod for people to try and get in that good fishing pole range. So from a stripping guide, another digression, but number of different stripping guides on the market. So you would get them in nickel silver traditionally, but you could have got them in chrome plated brass. They would either come all metal, they would come with glass inserts or what we'll call fake agate or agatine, or they would have agate inserts. And then they would come in various colors. So not really important from a rod perspective because a stripping guide is a stripping guide is a stripping guide. And traditionally they don't get broken. But agate and glass ferrules can break. Nickel silver ferrules, I mean, you really got to take a hammer to it.
Sure. So before you move on then, and again, for the folks that are new to bamboo rods, what exactly is a stripping guide? It's the first guide after the reel seam.
Yes.
Correct?
Yep,
Okay.
that is correct. So when you're holding the rod, and graphite's the same way, fiberglass the same way. When you're holding the rod, the reel comes off, the line comes off the reel, and the first guide it hits is the stripping guide. It's usually traditionally it's a bit bigger.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the size as the first guide on your midsection if you're looking at a 3-piece rod, or the next guide up on a 2-piece rod.
Understood.
It's about the same size, maybe a touch bigger.
Okay.
Typically it wouldn't be small.
Thank you.
And we just talked about this, so I'm going to skip through that. Now let's get into the real fishing poles, the good stuff. Moving up, $100 to $1,000. Some of the characteristics, you're going to have plenty of guides, right? So it's going to be spaced very similar to the rods that you build today. Now, let's not fool anybody. There's definitely rods made today that don't have a lot of guides on them, not as often as in the past. But you can get some inexpensive graphite fly rods that don't have enough guides on them. But traditionally, you're going to have at least as many as what I would call the last category. But on the really good fishing poles, you're going to have plenty of guides. It's not going to hamper or impact your casting. They're gonna have functional quality seats, nickel silver. Remember that plastic was cutting edge in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So that was really good stuff. So don't be fooled by the fact that they're plastic. That's okay. Because back in the day, plastic is what everybody wanted and used. The ferrules are traditionally high quality. They're going to be soldered welts on them. It's going to be the next step up from the guides or the ferrules that I just showed. Your stripping guides, as well as your guides themselves, are going to be stainless, tungsten. Agate stripping guides are traditionally going to be on those types of rods. And the node spacing traditionally is going to be more thought out. Right, you're not going to have nodes that lay right next to each other. In the rod building world, you never want to have a node touching a node, because that's traditionally considered the weak point of the actual fly.
Of the actual rod, right?
Right.
So, and again, for beginners in node, when bamboo grows, of course, there are rings when you look at a natural bamboo stock. So when splitting the cane, those nodes are apparent when you're looking at a rod. Now, for a beginner, is it really important for someone to be concerned about node spacing?
I would tell you, for a advanced person, it's not important to look at node spacing, right? I think it's important if you're going to spend a lot of money. You're going to go buy a $2,000 fly rod. The rod builder should have made the effort to do it right for you. But if you're going to look at a Leonard rod, or you're going to look at a F.E. Thomas rod, you're traditionally not going to have that problem. But with all that said, every rod shop had a bad day. I have a wonderful 8.5 foot EC Paul fly rod that's got nodes stacked on top of each other. They screwed up when they were building rods, and I'm told by the late Jim Clarkson of Raptor Rod Works, who passed away a number of years ago, that it's absolutely an EC Paul rod. It's not a Tony Maslin rod. He said the reality of it is they probably had a bad day. And what they do with those is they traditionally would job shop them, or they would rod shop them. They become loaner rods.
Okay.
And then what happens with every rod in the world? It makes its way into the world, right? So I managed to get a hold of one. It's a great casting fly rod. Nobody could tell me that they would know the difference. I shouldn't say nobody. There's probably some really spectacular casters, but 99% of the people out there wouldn't be able to do it.
Okay.
It's good stuff. So traditionally the nodes aren't going to be next to each other. And I would say with this category, you really want to gain a little bit of experience. Make a mistake on a $100 rod before you make a mistake on a $700. That makes sense.
Perfect sense.
Some of the brands. So Granger, the Wright McGill, most of the models are going to fall in this category, although you can hit some cheaper ones. Mid to high end head and rods. The Model 20, Model 35, I think, are magnificent rods. They're always really, really well done with the head, the head and rods. This is where the Orbis rods are going to be, right? So Orbis, I know everybody looks at the catalog, and I don't know if Orbis rods are in the catalog anymore.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
they look at the catalog, or when they did look at the catalog, Orbis rods are $2,200. You can still go out. I can think of 3 locations right now where you can buy a rod from the 60s and 70s, an Orbis 1-tip or 2-tip rod, and they're going from between $350 and $400. What a great way to get a spectacular rod.
Mm-hmm.
Walton Powell rods fall into this category. Some of the longer EC Powell rods fall into this category. Winston, some of the longer rods fall into this category, although that's starting to creep up a little bit. The Cross South Bend rods fall into this category, which is a subset of the traditional South Bend rod. Cross was a higher branded name for South Bend back in the, I guess it was the 30s and 40s. Yeah. Phillipson, which was an offshoot of the Wright McGill company. Wonderful rods. To me, I think they're a little bit better rod than the Wright McGill, as well as the Granger rods. I think they're a little bit crisper action. All honesty, and people will disagree with me, I'm not a huge fan of the Granger rods. I don't think they're quite fast enough for my casting style. Mm-hmm. Although the 8.5 foot rod is a very sweet rod, so the 8.5 footer I think falls right into the wheelhouse of a tremendous Granger rod. F.E. Thomas, which to me are going to be traditionally a little bit slower unless you get into the big rods, but they fall into this category, although they're creeping up in price. And then some of the lower grade Edwards rods, as well as the mid grade Edwards rods, fall into this category.
Okay.
And that's going to be Bill and Gene Edwards, not Eugene Edwards. So just to tease this out a little bit more from a heading perspective, the 14-17, although the 14 is more on the lower end, it's not going to have quite enough guides. The 20-35, even the 50 in the longer side, the bigger rods, the 9.5 footers, you can definitely get into this price point. The price is pretty traditionally fixed for heading. They haven't moved around very much over the last, I'll say 10 years, with the exception of the two-piece rods. The two-piece rods seem to have really increased in price over the last, I'll say 2 years, to the point where they've become almost unattainable, which is kind of interesting. I don't want to say unattainable. They're certainly attainable. We lost my presentation. We're going to take a break.
We'll get it right back.
Technical difficulties. This was my day all day today.
Technology is a wonderful thing.
Yes.
Okay. That we're going to do that.
We'll make it big.
That.
Let's go find EC Powell. I think that's where we left.
Yep, I think so too.
One up.
There we go.
All right, so we're gonna come down one from there.
Okay.
So once again, on the Granger side, the Victory, the Aristocrat, the Favorite, the Deluxe, you can find them in that price point, as well as the Champion, which I didn't list here. The Lake and Stream also falls into this category. Granger rods seem to be increasing steadily. They seem to be ticking up a little bit more. They're certainly high quality.
Okay.
There's no doubt about it. Unfortunate part about it is they've been trumped up by so many people over the years that, as I say here, there's extreme prejudice, which increases the cost of those rods. For an equivalent head and rod, you'll pay 30% less for that equivalent head and rod. I'm making that number up, but it's going to be someplace in that ball.
Okay.
There's some comparisons. The one on the left is I think that's a Folsom trade rod that was made by Head, and the one on the right is a Wright McGill Victory.
And this is a great example of where people are going to find the branding of those.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. With these rods, you're either going to find it on the reel seat, or you're going to find it just above the winding check on the cord. And that's almost pervasive. That's almost pervasive. Some additional ones, South Bend. Most people don't know, or some people know, some people don't know, that West Jordan actually saved the South Bend company. And I think everybody knows West Jordan with Orvis, but not a lot of people recognize that West Jordan, not only did he start a company in Massachusetts, but when the company in Massachusetts sold the rod business to South Bend, West Jordan was kind of like the player to be named later. He went and ran the rod shop for 7 or 8 years,
Sure.
Something of that nature. So kind of an interesting point there. Orvis, I tell everybody, if you want to buy your first rod, just go buy an Orvis 7.5 foot rod. You can't go wrong for a 8 foot rod, depending on what type of water you fish. We're going to talk about that in a minute. They're consistent, but they can tend to be a little bit heavy. If the rod's heavy, just use a little bit heavier reel. That'll help out the process. They are all over the place. They truly are on the market all the time. And from my perspective, you can't lose unless you pay twice as much as you should have for the rod. Okay. $400 to $600 is a great price point for an Orvis rod. And I don't know what a current Helios costs right now, but I'm pretty confident it's a lot more than $500.
I think you're probably right.
That's an example of a Madison version of the Orvis rod. That's a 7-footer, 3 3/8 ounces. Walton Powell and E.C. Powell, that's a family business. Walton Powell was the son of E.C. Powell. E.C. Powell was I don't know if it's in here, so I'll mention it. He was one of the 2 inventors of the hollow building process for bamboo rods. This concept is what the vast majority of people are using to build hollow built rods to this day. They're both West Coast builders. They're both very high end. Walton Powell rods are a little bit more attainable than E.C. Powell rods. But I can tell you right now, and I shouldn't say this because I was thinking about buying it. There's a 7-foot 8-inch Walton Powell rod on Coldwater Collectibles for $995. It's worth every dime. traditional smaller stream, mid-size stream fishing rod. It's a 3-piece 2-tip rod, and it's beautiful. An absolute gorgeous rod. The EC Paul rods have become a little bit more expensive. To get anything below a 9-footer is going to cost you a charge of money. 9-footers are going to typically go $1,200-1,300. So once you get to that 9, 8.5 foot, 8-foot rod, they become a little bit more challenging.
So one question for you real quickly about a Powell rod. So in terms of again, beginners looking at their first bamboo rod, if they run into a Powell hexagraph. Yeah, so the hexagraph can be a bit confusing for people. Can you touch on that real quickly?
Absolutely. So I'll give you a story. My wife left, so she's not in the room anymore. Back when I got married a long time ago, my wife gave me a Powell hexagraph for our engagement gift. And it's kind of interesting because it's a love-hate relationship with the Powell hexagraph. What a hexagraph rod is it's graphite that's laminated on a foam core in a hexagonal pattern.
Okay.
And it was invented by Walker and Bampton in England, if I remember the name correctly. That was co-marketed from a design as well as from a marketing perspective by Walton Powell. But it's actually a graphite rod with nickel silver ferrous. Anybody that doesn't like them has never cast one. They cast tremendously well, but there's a nuance with them in the sense that people want to think they're bamboo, but they're really not bamboo. They're graphite.
Okay.
Right. So I don't know what the right word is. There's a challenge with them. People downplay them, but they cast really, really nice. You got to find the right line.
Mm-hmm. So
right?
you shouldn't shy away from it. If they find a hexagraph, you shouldn't shy away from it, but understand it. You may not necessarily, you're not buying a bamboo rod.
That is correct. You're not buying a bamboo rod, but they're wonderful fishing poles.
Okay. They're
tremendous fishing poles. I have it. It's a 7.5 foot, 4, 5, 6. Walton Powell, this is a funny story. Walton Powell has a lot of history associated with him, and some of it positive, some of it negative. He was a bit ornery. He would market his fly rods as 3 lines, right? So I'm not going to use any names. If you go to a company and you buy a rod, they're going to say it's a 5-way. And I've bought rods from really nice companies, really big, really expensive companies. And I've said, I want a 7.5 foot, 4, 5-way. And they say, you want a 4 or do you want a 5? I know it's a bamboo rod, and I build bamboo rods. I don't build 5-sided bamboo rods, but I build bamboo rods. But I get you think you can make it a 5, but I know that there's variability in the materials.
Of course.
Oh no, we make it. If you want a 5, we're going to make a 5. Walton Powell said, you put a light line on it, you can cast further. If you put a heavy line on it, you can cast shorter, and it's going to load the rod properly because loading a rod is all about weight, right? So if you have a heavy line on a short cast, it's going to put the right amount of weight on the rod to cast the line. So it's kind of a funny, that was a diatribe. I don't know why we talked about that, but it's neat stuff. Walton Powell was a brilliant man. He was definitely a bit ornery, and he definitely aggravated a lot of people. His dad was brilliant. His dad's rod building prowess is still used to this day by the greatest rod builders in the world. So it's good stuff. And there's some examples. The rod on the left is a 9.5 foot C taper, Powell C taper, which that's another whole presentation. Maybe I'll come back and give later. It's a great salmon. I use that for landlocked salmon in Maine. It's going to Maine with me in 2 weeks for a week to fish landlocked salmon on the West Branch of Penobscot. And the rod on the right was built by a gentleman by the name of Don Holbrook, who was a West Coast builder that some say helped save the bamboo rod building world by offering one of the first manuscripts on how to build a bamboo fly rod.
Okay. Not
the Garrison book, which is incredibly, I don't want to insult anybody. It's detailed. You need to be, I don't want to say you need to be a mathematician, but you need to spend time reading. The Don Holbrook manuscript it's a paper version. I mean, you could tell he did it in paper. And he helped save the bamboo rod building world with teaching people how to build bamboo rods and giving them the explanations of how to do things. And he built in the EC Powell tradition, right? So all of his rods look just like EC Powell rods, and he built them the same way. Okay. But he built them, I believe he built them by hand. I don't think he used a saw. So Don Holbrook rods are tremendous. That's an 8-footer. That's what I call the poor man's EC Powell because it's kind of the same thing. And I managed to obtain that once in a weird spot for not very much money, and I use it all the time. Continuing on, because this was supposed to take an hour and we're on 55 minutes, and I still got a ways to go. Phillipson, he was the manager of the Granger Rod Shop, or the Wright McGill Rod Shop. He started his own company, once again in Denver, Colorado, or just outside of Denver. Those rods are on par with Granger and Wright McGill rods. I would call them a little bit faster. I think they tend to be a little bit crisper. Somebody will disagree with me, but that's just my opinion. I have an 8-footer that I love. I dislike the Wright and McGill or the Granger 8-foot rod, and everybody loves it except for me.
I'm a fan of Phillipson myself, so
Yep.
I understand what you're saying.
And they're 8.5-footer. That's a great first rod for people that are going to fish bigger rivers. Like, I fish 8.5-foot rods on the bat and kill all the time. I don't have a problem with that. But like the West Branch of the Delaware, if you're going to go out and fish some of those bigger rivers out west, marvelous rods for out there. And obviously that's what they were built for. And then Winston, Lou Stoner, he was the other person that patented a hollow building process. He was one of the founders of Winston and Stoner. I'm not going to try and figure out who the first person was. He's world famous for his building patent, his rod building patent, or his hollow building patent. His build and, the Winston build and cosmetics are top notch. I mean, they're just spectacular. And the lineage of rod builders that have come out of the Winston shop are tremendous, very on par with Orvis. I mean, some of the rod builders that have come out of Orvis, once again, tremendous, as well as Leonard. We could go on and on. But once again, a West Coast builder, they built for big rivers, which is nice. If you buy an 8.5-foot Winston, you can use it on any big river in the country because that's what they were built for. They are high end. This is at the top of that $1,000 mark. Got one less tip. Typically, they'll come with one tip at that price point. They came with 2 tips, but they also made rods with 1 tip.
Okay.
As did Orvis. So that's something that I don't know if I mentioned earlier. Orvis sold a lot of rods with 1. Which, how many tips can you fish at once?
Mm-hmm.
And the reality of it is, in my life, I broke 2 rods. My whole life, and I fished 75 days. I broke 2 rods. One of them because I fell off the railroad tracks and drove it into the ground.
That'll do it.
That'll definitely do it. And the other one, I set a fish too hard, and I put the midsection into a tree trunk above me, which that's not fair, right? That's not fair to the.
I think I would call that angler error more than.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. So why do you need 2 tips? I don't know, because when I build a rod for myself in my house, because I try and build myself 1 rod every year, I only build myself. I don't think it makes sense to do it. That's me. And then Iffy Thomas, I didn't go into much detail here, but the Durango, the Bangor, the Special, all wonderful rods. A little bit harder to attain these days. The Durango is the one you're going to find. And you can still, I mean, I just sold one for $375. And it was a nice rod. It was well worth it. It was a 9-footer. So you can still find them. You just got to find the right person to sell. And then the stuff that we're not going to talk about. And I know sometimes people want to talk about these, but this isn't part of the blue collar world. Right, the Leonards, the Paynes, the Dickersons, the Garrisons, the Thomas and Thomases, the Paul Youngs, splendid rods. I own a number of these, not a number of each of these. That would be nice.
Great, yeah.
That would be nice. I don't own very many of them. I have owned 1, 2, 3, 4 of these 6. I still own 1 of these 6. The rest of them that I've flipped because, to be honest with you, I didn't want to break a $2,000. I just didn't want to do that. If I was going to break a $2,000 fly rod, I'd break a sweetgrass because I could send it back and they'll fix it. So we're not going to talk about that. That's another whole topic.
Okay.
Buying your first rod. What are some of the rules? I think it's important to pick a type, length and weight. So what do you fish, right? Do you fish small streams? Do you mid-sized streams? Do you fish large rivers? But you're not going to want to go fish a large river with a 6-foot or 6.5-foot rod. And I think, unfortunately, far too many times people will go out and they'll buy a 7-foot rod and then they'll go try and fish the West Branch. Well, people don't fish the West Branch with a 7-foot graphite rod. Why would they try and do it with a Vanderbilt? Doesn't make any sense. It's a tool for the job. So you got to figure out what type of stream you want to fish and what do you want to fish for. Not going to use a 7.5-foot rod on pike. Why would you do that? It doesn't make sense. It's not good for the rod or the fish. Pick a price point. What can you afford, right? Far too often people say to me that I can't believe you fished that rod. That's really expensive. But they're standing there with me next to me with a Helios rod or a Sage, whatever graphite they're up to or whatever. I'm out of the new market. I still use an IM6 rod. And I fish graphite, I use an IM6. But they're standing there with $1,000 rod, and they're curious why I'm using a $600 rod. Well, because why not?
Right.
Why not? It doesn't make sense.
You enjoy it. That's all.
Exactly, and that's right. Because I enjoy it. So you got to pick a price point. Certainly pick what you can afford. You don't have to spend much more than $200, $150 to $300. I'll say $150 to $300 for that first level to get a really good rod. But the important piece is, where do you go? Right, and that's the piece that's really intimidating. You can search garage sales and yard sales for days, weeks, and months, and you're going to buy a lot of trash. You may find one sweet one, but you're going to buy a lot of trash. So there's a number of different outlets. And I'm going to go ahead a slide and see if I break these down. No. So some of the outlets that you can find: eBay, Classic Fly Fisherman, both places you can go. Jordan Mills, he's a purveyor out of, I think he's in Albany, the Albany area now. Coldwater Collectibles, he's out in Michigan. There's advantages and disadvantages to all of these folks. Understanding the advantages and disadvantages, I think, are important. But you need to understand the rules first, right? Cheap rods are certainly going to be cheaper. Right? They shouldn't be expensive.
That's right.
Right? If you have a Grampus rod, it's never going to be worth $1,000. So don't pay $1,000 for it. Typically, they're going to be the production companies. Good rods are more expensive. It's a shop company. If you go to Leonard didn't build 100,000 rods a year. I don't know how many they built, but they didn't build 100,000. Let's talk about Orvis, right? They're on 100,000 rods, give or take, since 1940. So do the math. I'm not that smart, but that's not that many rods a year. It's a lot of rods, but it's not like Hedden, who literally, the quote in the Hedden book, which is a marvelous read if you ever have a chance to read Michael Sinclair's Hedden book. They were interviewing Bernard Hills, I think it was. He was the shop foreman at the time, or he was the shop foreman when the rod company closed down. And and Sinclair asked him the question, "How many rods did you build a year?" And he turned and he looked out his window and he said, "You see all those blades of grass out there? We built more than that." So that's how we put it in perspective. So kind of a neat quote. Yeah. And I think it was Bernard Hills was the person that he asked the question of. It was definitely in the Michael Sinclair book. Great read if you really want to learn about the history. Some additional general rules. If it's missing a tip, you can figure about 33% decrease in cost. Longer is always going to be cheaper. 8.5 foot and bigger is going to be more expensive. Always is. I shouldn't use the word are traditionally going to be more expensive. There you go. Typically, you can expect around a 50% reduction, give or take. Shorter is typically going to be more expensive. 7-foot rod, 7.5 foot rod by the same company in the same model is going to be a 50% increase on that 8.5 or the 9-foot rod. Well, in particular, the 8.5. 9-foot rods go down in price tremendously. Sure. If you buy it right, you'll traditionally get the vast majority of your money. Right? If you go to a reputable dealer and you buy it from them at a reasonable price, and they try and charge the fair market value, when you sell it back, as long as you don't go back to one of those same dealers, you're going to traditionally get the majority of your money. Right. So if I go to a dealer and I give them $1,000 and I want to sell it back to them 2 weeks later, they're going to give me $500 because they're going to try and double their money. That's just the rule of thumb, right? But if you take that $1,000 and $1,000 rod and you try and market it to the world yourself, you're going to get $800. Maybe you get $750. But now let's talk about a $200. You get $200 for a rod and you hate it and you try and sell it back to the world. Somebody like you who wants to try a rod, what are you going to lose? $40? Doing that same 80% or 75% mark, you're going to lose $50, $70. You use it for a year. What can you use for a year for $75?
You get coffee for a year.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So kind of an interesting concept. I will give a general rule number 4. You cannot buy every rod on the market. I have physically tried. It's impossible to buy them all. So
yeah, but it's fun to try.
It is, but when you have 75 rods on a wall, yeah, you eventually say to yourself, "What am I doing to myself?" Right? And from my personal experience, when 50 of them need to be restored, it's like I've got enough rods here to restore the rest of my life. I don't need anybody else's rods. So that's that. I would call that general rule number 4. Don't try and buy them all because You can't possibly. Somebody else wants them more than you. What to look for when you buy a used rod. If you're walking through the garage sale, things to look for: delaminations. That's where the cane's coming apart, right? That you can't use that, physically use that rod.
And those are noticeable when you run your fingers around the strips of the bamboo. The laminated sections will be somewhat sharp. Is that
I would agree with that. I think an easier way to feel it is if you joint the rod together and you shake it and it wobbles and clicks.
here to click?
Right, that's going to be one reason why it could click.
Okay.
Cracked ferrules, that's another reason why it can click. Delaminations, cracked ferrules, there's no recovery from that unless you're a restorationist or you want to pay somebody a lot of money to restore it. Short tips. This is going to cause controversy, but I'm going to make the statement. When you're buying your first bamboo rod or first couple of bamboo rods, shy away from rods that have different tip lengths, because traditionally 99% of the rods made over the course of the years have had the same length tips as the butt sections. Now there's exceptions. There's some Orvis made some rods with various lengths. Walton Powell made some rods with some various lengths. They say E.C. Powell, but it was probably Tony Maslin made some rods with various lengths. The Europeans did all kinds of wacky stuff. But from a general production rod company perspective, the length of the tips should be the same as the length of for the midsection.
All sections should be
all sections should be the same. And that's why I got into the staggered section. From a staggered section length perspective, rods traditionally came in 6.5, 7, 7.5, 8, 8.5, 9, 9.5, 10. And it's very straightforward reason with production companies. It was easier to mass produce them if they were all the same length. Right? I'm convinced, and I think you'll appreciate this. If you take a 9.5 foot, 2 3/4 head rod, 3-piece rod, you take that tip and you cut 2 inches off of it, it's the same tip as a 9 foot, 2.5 row. Because I think they had 40-inch sections. And if I needed a 36-inch section, I cut 3 inches off the end, right? If I needed a 34-inch section, I cut whatever the length is, right? You got to do the math, right? I'm convinced that's the case. I've mic'd it and shown that it's the case. The variability is in the years that the rods were made. That's what I've seen, right? So if you got a rod from the 40s, the taper changed a little bit from the 30s to the 40s to the 50s.
Okay.
That's an anecdotal assessment on my part, but I think it's an interesting concept because if I have to make rods, you make all 42-inch rod length tips, and then you can trim them back to get to the length you want in order to make 5 different models.
Understood.
Or 5 different tapers. So it's an interesting concept. May not be right, but it's an interesting one. Ferrule fit loose to each other, so the metal to metal fit is poor. The ferrule fit is loose to the bamboo. So the ferrule on the bamboo is the glue's broken down. I think that's the main reason why head and rods, that traditionally people will say that head and rods break at the female ferrule on the midsection. I think it's because of ferrule fit. I think it's because the wood to metal connection has failed over time and people don't recognize that and they continue to cast it because they're pinned, so they stay together. And ultimately that flexing causes it to weaken that cane and eventually
breaks.
So delaminations, cracked ferrules, ferrule fits that are loose, short tips, those are things you really want to stay away from.
Okay.
And then the last thing is if cork's falling apart, you need to replace it, right? So that's going to cost you effort. And then stains in the bamboo. Stains in the bamboo could potentially be caused by water damage. Water damage will weaken the cane. Weakened cane will eventually delaminate and or just break. So some of the misnomer things you want to look for if you're trying to buy a rod out in the garage sale market or on eBay if you get good enough pictures. So where to buy? eBay. You can get good prices on eBay. Problem with eBay is there's one, a lot of crooks, and 2, there's no quality control, right? So my grandfather's rod was $1,000 in 1955, and it's never been used. And then when you get it, it's in 14 pieces, right? So you got to pay attention to that. That picture right there, you brought this up earlier, so I'm going to mention it. That's one of the classic Horrican Ibbotson acetates that was on a fly rod that I restored. Actually, it's kind of it's a Best Buy test. It's actually a carp, which is kind of weird on a trout rod. So dealers can be expensive. You get what you pay for, right? Their quality control is tremendous, but some of their quality control is not as good as other people, right? So you gotta kind of understand the people that you're working with and level of trust. You need to be able to read people. And then private sales, restorationists, they're somewhere in the middle. Typically they'll have fair QC, but one restorationist may not be as good as another restorationist. One collector may not be as good as another collector. So this doesn't give you a tremendous amount of information, but it kind of gives you some things.
What to watch for.
This is a difficult one. But once again, if you spend $200, you can only lose them. Let's talk about restoration costs. Ferrule resets are typically going to cost you $50. All right, so let's say you spend $150 on a rod. You need the ferrules reset. You got the butt to mid. You got the mid to tip. You got the mid to tip. You're in it for another $150. You have to reset all those ferrules. Each wrap is typically going to cost you $10. Right? So if you got to wrap the guides, rewrap the whole guide, the guides, it's going to $10 guide. $10 guide on a 12 guide rod is $120.
You can see where that can add up
This
quickly.
So rewrap and revarnish. Traditionally, you're going to get between $200 and $350. Varnish dip, if you just want it redipped, that's 3 or 4 hours of somebody's time. Who works for $10 an hour these days?
Not many people.
Not very many people.
No.
And then if you have a broken section, you want to have it scarfed or put back together to full length, that's typically around $50. Right? So if you buy a rod that needs to be restored, or let's say you find your grandfather's rod and you want to get it restored, you're looking at probably spending $300 to $500, which really makes you ask the question, what's the rod worth to begin with? Right? I won't take in projects unless they're for myself or a friend that isn't going to pay me anyhow, right? So if they're not going to pay me, what's the difference? I won't take in a rod that's worth $150 because I can't, with good conscience, say to you, you need to give me $400 to restore this rod, but it takes me 30 hours to do a good job on a restoration,
Sure.
right? So I can work for less than $10 an hour, but that's not, I can also go to work and make a lot more than $10 an hour, right? It gets back to why I'm not a successful bamboo rod builder restorationist. And then what to buy from a stream perspective, right? If you're going to fish small streams, 7 to 8 foot, 4 to 6 weights, you know, if you're going to look in that $100 to $200 price range, $200 price range, the head and number 2 ferrule 8-foot rod and the trade versions or the lower level versions, tremendous first rod. It's typically going to be a 5 or a 6 weight. Really a wonderful opportunity to get into a good $100 to $200 rod. And they're typically pretty attainable in that Model 10, Model 13 area in good shape, whether it's a trade rod or a branded rod. The HI spinner, Canada Creek, and the 8-foot rods are not very common, but if you can find one, that's a great rod to get into for very little money. Probably that's on the $100 range, not the $200 range. And then if you can find a South Bend 290, 7.5 foot 2-piece 1-tip rod or 2-piece 2-tip rod, you can traditionally get them between 100 and 200. So,
and those are good rods.
Yeah, and those are tremendous rods. They're short guides, right? Traditionally, I think they only had 6 guides. But the reality of it is, how far are you casting 7? Right, you're using it for brook trout, you're using it on small streams. If you're trying to cast 60 feet, you're not using, I don't know what you're doing, you're in the trees. So when you get into the $200 to $500 range on the 7 to 8 foot rods, that Heddon 1.5 or 1 3/4 ferrule, and that's going to cause all kinds of confusion. Heddon used a funky method of identifying their ferrules, but that's their traditional terminology for it. So that's what I'm using here. I'm not going to tell you the sizes. The low end models you can traditionally get from $200 to $500 in that 8 foot version. I recently, it was a couple of years ago, bought a model 14 1.5 ferrule Heddon for $300 that is in as new condition. So you can find them. The Granger 8040 and the Champion Victory or one of the trade rod versions, typically you're only going to get 1 tip with those. One of the tips have been lost, so it reduces the cost. If you had 2 tips, you'd be in that 500. You'd be sure. You'd be peaking out that top end. Phillips and 8 foot rods are going to be in that same price point. Yeah, I would say in about that same price point, 450, maybe 500, 550. And then the Orvis Madison 7.5 foot rods, you can get a great Orvis Madison 1-tip rod in 7.5 foot or even 8 foot for that $400, $350 to $400.
Also great rods.
Tremendous rods, absolutely tremendous rods. Don't be shy away from the fact that it doesn't say batten kill. Then if you're going to go really big, the head 1.5, 7.5 footers, the Granger 8040s and the higher grades, Orvis batten kills with 2 tips. And then there's multiple current makers that'll make them for you. I put a reference in here to Marci. He's a friend of mine. Marci, his phone number is there. He'll build a 1-tip rod in that $750, $800 price point, and that's a brand new rod. Any rod you want him to do, right? And he does marvelous work. If you can find a South Bend 1500, it's a wonderful rod. I've only cast it once in my life, but they're beautiful. They're very petite and streamlined, and it's a good way to go. Moving on to bigger rivers, 8 to 9 foot rods, 5 to 7 weight. It's going to be a little bit more of a hardcore fishing rod. Cast at long distances. The head and 8 foot rods in the trade versions, whether it's 1 3/4 or the 2 ferrules. I'm a huge fan of the head and number 2 ferrule 8.5 foot rods.
Okay.
To me, that's the epitome of a mid to big rod, big river rod. That's what I use on the West Branch of the Doe.
Okay.
And it's usually going to be a 6 weight, could be a 5. Traditionally, it's a 6 weight. From a river perspective, I'd probably stay away from the spinner and the Canada Creek because it's just a dumb enough backbone. The South Bend 323 and the 9 foot or 8.5 foot, that's going to be on the less expensive side. And the Montague flip lines and the fish kills are both really good rods for that style and that lower price point.
Sure.
And then we'll step up into the higher price point or the mid-level high price point. The ones that I would add here are the batten kill 8 footers, 8.5 footers, and the 2-1, 2-2 versions, and then the Phillipson pacemaker, which is going to be that $400 price point. That Phillipson 8.5 foot rod is a tremendous, as well as the Wright and McGill. The Wright and McGill 8.5 foot rod is a tremendous rod. And then getting into the expensive stuff, Granger 8040s, Granger 8642s, they carry a premium. Right, so you can pay a little bit more money for that mid-level to upper level models. The batten kills in the 3.2 version are tremendous fishing poles. Wonderful rods. They pack well. They cast a 6 weight line to die for. So if you can find one of those, that's a great way to go. On the 2.2 side, I probably would go the 4 1/8 ounce or the 4 1/4 ounce. I'd probably stay away from the 4 3/8 ounce. That's a little bit heavier rod, unless you really want a 7 weight. And then the Walton Powell rods, the 8'4" and 9 foots, smashing rods in 2.2. 3.2 every once in a while you can find a clunker, but the 2.2, the 2-piece, 2-tip, 8 foot board and 9 foot Walton Powell rods are always spot on. Same thing with the EC Powell rods. Problem is they become more expensive.
Sure.
Right. EC has a premium to Walton, but they both cast tremendously. And then Winston, 8.5 to 9.5 foot rods, 2-1, 7 weights. It's going to be the bigger rods. I don't even know if you can get an 8.5 foot now at this point with 1 tip for $700. That's going to be on the higher end. And then once again, I put Muncie's name in here because he'll build you whatever you want. That's the neat part about going to one of these boutique rod builders. You want a 6 foot rod, they'll build it. You want an 8.5 foot rod, they'll build it. And he can do all of those. And that's basically what we have, besides some pretty pictures, right? So I wanted to be sexy at the end because when you're here fishing for these, bamboo feels right, and that's a John Pickard rod, which he's on the expensive side. Let's throw it in there because that's the closest I'll ever get to a picture. And I think that's it.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and end our screen share here and let everybody see us again. So the bottom line is there's a lot of options. Not only there's a lot of things to look for, but apparently there's a lot of rods available at reasonable price points for people that want to get into bamboo. There's really no reason to be intimidated by bamboo. I mean, it's a wonderful tool. It's a lot of fun to fish with. And as you pointed out, there's a lot of options out there for people to explore. You don't need to spend a lot of money to get into bamboo. Now, I confess that once you go down that path and you start using bamboo, your tastes and your casting abilities may improve, and ultimately you may want to move up in price point to some better rods. but certainly for the beginner, you don't need to start out at those big dollar rods.
I agree entirely. I would caution that it is a rabbit hole. When you get your first one, you quickly get to your second one, then you start reading. And when you start reading and you go on Clark's Fly Rod forum and you start reading what other people say, and I'm the first person to say, don't believe anything you read on the internet, because 3/4 of it is wrong and or misinformed, but just the same, 1/4 of it is good. And understanding the differences are really important. It becomes a rabbit hole. You want to get into it. It's amazing how quickly people get into it.
Sure.
And it is a lot of fun. I can't say enough how much I've enjoyed it over the years. And having gone from just fishing them to restoring them to building them has been a great activity, and the history related to it is even more fun than the building part. So.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is fishing bamboo is a lot of fun. Don't be intimidated by it. And I hope folks have had an opportunity to learn. Of course, you're welcome to come back and take a look at this webinar anytime. It's available on AMFF.org. John, I want to thank you very much for coming in today. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
It's been wonderful. I appreciate it. And one thing I'll offer before I leave, don't believe anything I just said. I made most of it up as I was going along.
Well, one thing you didn't make up was your email address. So
that is true.
If people have questions, again, they can send an email to you.
Yep. And that would be the Adirondack Rod Company @gmail.com.
Terrific.
So
John,
perfect. I appreciate your time.
once again,
I appreciate
thank you.
everybody else's time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.